I debated good afternoon or good evening because it's 5 o'clock and it's still light out, but I was told definitively if it's happy hour, it's good evening. So welcome everyone to Penn Law School. Thank you for attending. My name is Chris Welsh. I'm the Executive Director of CERL, and last year we had the honor of hosting many distinguished guests to our book talk series, including General Michael Hayden, Professor Kathleen Hall Jameson. And in keeping with that tradition, for the first book talk of this academic year, we're honored to welcome another distinguished guest, Mr. David McCraw, Deputy General Counsel for the New York Times, to Penn Law to discuss his most recent book, Truth in Our Times, Inside the Fight for Press Freedom in the Age of Alternative Facts. But before I formally introduce David and our moderator, CERL's founder and faculty director, Claire Finkelstein, I just want to take a brief moment to talk a little bit about the center. So what is our mission? What is it that we do? We're a nonpartisan, interdisciplinary institute dedicated to preserving and promoting ethics and the rule of law in national security, democratic governance, conflict, and war. That's pretty heavy, right? So what does that mean? How do we actually do that? Well, there's 4 ways that I think that we do that and that we do that well. First is to educate the public. We have a book talk series, of which this is the first, and we're happy that you're here and hope that you'll join us for the rest of the series. We have a series of public keynote addresses with high-level officials working in the national security field throughout the year. We have a blog which we regularly post. We post both national security leaders and student blog posts on pressing national security issues. And we have a social media presence. So that's how we educate the public. And the book talk series, the next one that we're having is on October 10th, and Julie Solomon will be here to discuss her book, An Innocent Bystander, The Killing of Leon Klinghoffer. Second, we educate students. How do we do that? We involve our students in all of the events that I just talked about, but also we have a summer internship program. We have a summer internship program that's focused on instilling ethics and rule of law values in students that are going to go on and practice in the national security field. And we're grateful to people like Mr. McCraw for helping bring in national security professionals to speak with our students. This summer we had Scott Shane, a national security reporter from the New York Times, come to speak with our students about the issues that he's worked on. Third, we influence policy. We try and publish policy papers on pressing national security issues and get them in the hands of the people that are making the decisions that matter to us. And we also host a variety of briefings each year at the Pentagon with high-level officials that are on the front lines working on national security. And fourth, we try to advance academic thought. Most of our conferences, some of our conferences each year that we hold are focused around producing a volume, an academic volume for our series, Ethics, National Security, and the Rule of Law with the Oxford University Press. So with that, if you want to get more involved with CERL, I just encourage you to visit our website and to sign up for our mailing list, and also to keep attending these events. I'd like to introduce our distinguished guest, David McCraw. He's worked for the New York Times for the past 17 years, where he currently serves as the Times' top newsroom lawyer. In that role, he's been the principal legal advisor on a range of issues, national security issues, and others. He's the lead litigation attorney for the Freedom of Information Act lawsuits brought by the New York Times, and he and his reporters have litigated over 60 cases with the federal government, probably even more than that. He is the New York Times crisis response manager when journalists are kidnapped or detained overseas, and has worked on numerous initiatives with various nonprofits to protect the safety of journalists in conflict zones. His pro bono work on press freedom and public access to information has spanned the globe and a variety of countries, from Yemen to Montenegro to Russia and a variety of other countries. And on top of all those other accomplishments, he's a really nice guy, and he's a friend to CERL, and we're happy to have him here. Professor Claire Finkelstein is the Algernon Biddle Professor of Law and Philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. In 2019, she was named a Senior Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, an expert in law and the law of armed conflict, military ethics, national security law. She's the co-editor of our Oxford University Press series, Ethics, National Security, and the Rule of Law. And in 2012, she founded this center, which you're here for today. So thank you all for coming, and we look forward to a great discussion between Claire and Mr. McCraw.
Thank you. David, it is really wonderful to have you here, and this book is an absolute delight. For those of you who haven't yet read the book, there'll be maybe a few spoilers along the way, but the book will be on sale after the talk, and David will be, I gather, willing to sign them.
Very willing.
Okay, wonderful. And we invite you all to join us for that and for a reception. The initial impetus for writing this book came from a letter that was eventually published and went viral on the internet, as people always say viral. Internet is always viral, but this one really did, and I gathered that gave you inspiration to write a book to expand on some of the issues that came up around the exchange involving that letter. Can you tell us about the letter and your thought process there?
Yeah, in October, and thank you so much for being here. It's always a delight to be here. I've spent the last hour talking to Claire, which means my head hurts because she has such great questions, so smart about these issues. So if I don't make sense, blame her. In 2016, October 2016, do you remember the whole incident had arisen about candidate Trump and women as a result of the Hollywood tape. And he had answered some of the questions about his views of women at the debate on a Sunday night. Right after that, the New York Times did a story that was about two women who claimed they had been groped by Mr. Trump many years earlier. And the story was sent to me by email, as it always is, to read in advance. And I was on my way to teach my class at NYU Law School. I read it on the subway. And I thought it was a terrific piece of journalism. And this is the reason I thought that, is that we had reason to believe these accounts were true. But we also revealed a lot of facts around that readers could make their own decision about whether to believe or not. Many years had passed. They hadn't reported to others, all that stuff. And our reporters had talked to candidate Trump. And it just felt to me like this is what journalism should do on an issue that was right in front of people. And so the Trump campaign started issuing these statements that they were going to sue the New York Times, they're going to sue the New York Times. And this goes all day on Wednesday after the story has appeared. And Wednesday night, about 8 o'clock, our PR person emails me and says, we understand that they're going to sue tonight. And I'm thinking to myself, you know, I'm a New York lawyer. I know there's one court open in New York at 8 o'clock. That's the Bronx Criminal Court. And they see really crazy stuff there, okay? No question about it. Bronx Criminal Court. You see crazy stuff, but you do not see a lot of libel suits from presidential candidates. And so, as it turned out, what happened, in fact, was a letter came in from Mr. Trump's lawyers asking us to retract the statement and so forth. And they put it on the internet, and I felt, and my colleagues in legal thought, we had to respond to it in some way. And in fact, we did. I wrote a letter that's about 13 sentences long, And it went out on the internet, and as you say, it went viral.
Yeah, and the letter, right, which is reproduced in the back of the book, is quite charming, to the point, and very factual. And what you say is that we did what the law allows. We published newsworthy information about a subject of deep public concern. If Mr. Trump disagrees, if he believes that American citizens had no right to hear what these women had to say, and that the law of this country forces us and those who would dare to criticize him to stand silent or be punished, we welcome the opportunity to have a court set him straight.
That was a little cheeky.
It was really cheeky, yeah.
Yeah.
So what happened
well,
after that?
So you know, I write this letter, and a friend calls and says, do you realize your employer has just put your phone number and email address online? Because they put the whole letter up, and it's up there in my letterhead. And I'm going, I sort of got that because my email has exploded. You know? and you know, I'm kind of a big believer in transparency, but not that kind of transparency, but here we go. And the response is actually really quite wonderful. There are a few people who issued dissenting opinions to my letter, but I had, and this is very unusual in this day and age, I actually had interesting back and forth with them. But many people, it was a moment. I think it's a very good letter. I'm proud of that letter. But for much of it, it really was kind of a moment that we were deep in the campaign. People were tired. People we're simply kind of ground up in it, and as somebody said, you know, it was kind of a reset for sanity to say, look, you know, here's what we're doing, and we have a right to do it. But as I talk about in the book, one of my favorite letters comes from a Hollywood lawyer, a retired Hollywood lawyer, and he writes this letter, and he says, you know, you must be incredibly lucky because you get to work for a company that lets you say what's on your mind. I worked in Hollywood, he continues, which meant that I had to write polite responses to all the jerks in Hollywood, and you can't believe how many jerks there are in Hollywood that, you know, I had to write to. And so it raises this question that people always ask me, which is, did your company really let you write that letter? Because it uses the decidedly unlegalistic term piece of ass, among other things, quoting Mr. Trump. And you know, as Claire just said, it suggests that maybe he should sue us. And right after the letter goes up, I'm sitting in my office, and I have a glass office, and I found out that moment, about 10 minutes after the letter was online, one of the really, really big disadvantages of having a glass office. And that is, you can see your CEO approaching your office when he has the letter in his hand and that sort of look on his face. And there's this moment where I'm thinking, like, maybe we should have run this by senior management. Maybe we should have taken a couple more minutes and done that. And so my CEO is an Englishman, Mark Thompson. He walks in and he holds up the letter and he says, "This is brilliant, but I'll never understand why you Americans capitalize after a colon." I thought to myself, this could have gone much worse. Okay? There will be no capitalization after any colon in my remarks tonight.
So what led to your decision to publicize the letter? And then what was your reaction to the reaction that you got to the letter that led you to write the book?
So in my line of work, and it wasn't my decision to make it public, I suppose I could have said, please don't do this, but because they had put their letter up and there were TV trucks outside the building, the morning news shows had led with the Trump campaign's letter to me and all of that. And so I was aware that we were probably going to put it up. I didn't expect the response we got. But in my line of work, I write lots of letters. I get letters from lawyers for people who don't like the way they're treated in the New York Times. Their lawyer writes a letter. I write it back. It has an audience of one. And a lot of times, I don't even know if they've read it because I never hear from them again. But I'm not a novelist. I don't need to have big ratings on Amazon for each of my letters. I just write it right back. But this one seemed to capture people's imagination, and it's what evolved into. So afterwards, I had sort of emerged as someone to talk about these issues, and I had an opportunity to write the book. And I really wanted the book to sneak up on people in this way, that there are some really great books that deal with the theory of the First Amendment, and I would recommend them to you. I think that's an important part of the discussion of the First Amendment. But what I wanted to do was really capture how the law applied day by day. It doesn't happen up in the abstract. It happens day by day when somebody comes to you and says, this happened to me, I just found 3 pages from Donald Trump's tax returns in my mailbox, okay? At that moment, you're not really worried about the theory of the First Amendment. You're worried about, can you publish those? What is going to happen if you publish them? I want people to really understand that. I was once introduced at Fordham Law School in an event like this as the person who tells New York Times reporters what to do. That is a real misunderstanding of both my job and, more importantly, New York Times reporters. Nobody tells New York Times reporters what to do. You know, insubordination is sort of our working model. And so I wanted to capture a little bit about that interaction between lawyers and reporters. How does that actually work? And I wanted to do it in the range of topics we deal with, whether we're getting a subpoena that may be going after a source, whether we're pursuing information through a freedom of information request, whether we're worried about libel, or whether we're publishing secret documents that somebody thinks we shouldn't have.
So when David is dealing with these incredibly complex, delicate matters, negotiating with the White House, dealing with the president, dealing with David Sanger, who keeps you busy all by himself, and so on and so forth. I asked David, how did you have time to write this book, given your day job? And he said, well, you know, I took some time off, a whole 12 weeks, because I thought about the 7 years I've been writing mine. But this trips off the tongue for you, and the I must say, the charm and grace with which you tell it is really extraordinary. You describe in the book, and I think this partly gets at your motivation in writing it, correct me if I'm wrong, the incredible shift that's happened in the Trump era from worrying about First Amendment issues, the details of New York Times against Sullivan, how does it play out in this issue, how does it play out in that issue? We worried a lot during the Obama era about journalists getting prosecuted to reveal their sources and so on. And all of that looks like, you know, so tame or sort of, you know, rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic now, because what has happened to the press and the way that the press is under attack is nothing that you were prepared for from all of that worrying about First Amendment. Can you describe a little the shift in atmosphere?
Right. So it's when I first got into this business, when I first became a newsroom lawyer at the New York Daily News in 2000 and then the New York Times in 2002, the focus was really on things like libel and subpoenas for sources and that sort of thing. That was really where the focus was. And it dealt very much with the law in the way that a lawyer would. What are you allowed to do? What are your defenses in a libel case? What's a proper libel claim? How do you get it dismissed? And the book becomes much more about what I think of as a hearts and minds problem, that the condemnation of the press by the president and by others, I think has undermined both the press and press freedom in ways that are damaging, that don't deal with any changes in law. You know, the president elect comes over to the Times. Right after the election, he comes over to the Times, meets with a group of reporters and editors, and the last question in this very long session, and he's charming in the way that he is, somebody asked him about, you know, you've been talking about how you want to change the libel laws, is that going to happen? And he says, you know, look, I went to a friend, and the friend says, you know, you keep talking about changing the libel laws, well, you know, Donald, you need those libel laws to protect you because you're the guy who's likely to get sued for the stuff you say. And the president-elect said, I thought about that, and I think he's right, so I think you're going to be okay. And I don't really, and I don't worry a lot about the law changing, and as much as disturbing it is to see Jim Acosta of CNN being shut down for asking a question, insisting on an answer to a press conference, how dare he? I'm really much more concerned about the erosion of popular belief in a free press. So just a couple months ago, there was a new Hill-Harris poll which showed 33% of the people agreed that the press was the enemy of the people. Okay. When I was writing the book, there was an Ipsos poll which showed that 26% of the respondents believe the president should be allowed to close down press organizations that misbehave. 1 in 4. You know, you remember Jefferson famously said, if I was given the choice between a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I would gladly choose the latter. Apparently there was a footnote until they really, really honked off the government, in which case it's all off, newspapers should go away. And it concerns me because that's really not democracy's plan.
Right, so what has happened here? I mean, it looks like Donald Trump's attack on the press was sort of like a match thrown into a kerosene-soaked haystack, right? Tell me about that haystack. I mean, what is the receptive audience for attacks on the press, and why do you think the American public doesn't see the press as one of the gatekeepers of democracy?
Yeah, and I think that's a complicated and really good question, and that because, as I say in the introduction, the fact that the president is saying it is disturbing, the fact that people are turning and chanting at the press is more disturbing, that it resonates. And I think you can look at a series of causes. One is the press needs to own some of this. We have at times not done as good a job as we should have. Many newspapers are under incredible pressure financially, and you're seeing across America local journalism in decline.
Do you mean in terms of accuracy or in terms of how you message your work?
I think that it's accuracy. I'm not going to own up to as part of the problem, because I think that what I've seen is that nothing's really changed. We make mistakes, we correct. We desperately try not to make mistakes. It hurts our brand, it hurts us financially, it's bad for America. We want to get it right. But it's not so much accuracy as perceived bias, the pursuit of clicks, things like that make people doubt. And there's concerns about fairness, and I understand why people see that. I grew up in Illinois. Virtually everybody I know in my hometown voted for Trump. I hear that. So, but it's important to remember that freedom of press was not premised on fairness. If you go back and you look at how vile the publishers were at the founding, at the Constitution, you see that it wasn't about fairness. We're lucky to live in a time where fairness is part of what prevents.
Because it was seen as part of political dissent.
That's right.
Right. So the opinion writing, the ability to speak up against the government was a core part of the motivation for protecting the freedom of the press.
Right. And so I understand why people can be unhappy about the press, but you know what? We sometimes do crazy things in elections. I think maybe some of you have seen that, okay? We don't suspend elections. If you're a lawyer, you've seen judges do really abhorrent, deplorable things. We do not end the court system because of that. And so the attack on the press, even if you have problems with the way the press is now, it concerns me that there are some people who don't make the distinction between the action of the press and the need for a free press. Not the same thing. You don't have to love the press to love freedom of the press. The second thing is the internet. And with the internet, I think, has had two consequences. We all see it, right? You have hate speech, you have online harassment, you have false information, you have disinformation campaigns run by the Russians and others. You have this undifferentiated mass of information out there, and I think what happens is that people start to have doubts about, is freedom really a good thing? there's so much out there, and so much seems bad. Does free expression really work? Does the First Amendment really work?
Right, and the question is whether or not the whole problem of foreign interference, foreign propaganda, which we've all been struggling with since the run-up to the 2016 election, it looks as though freedom of the press is playing into the ability of foreign countries to manipulate our voting population, right? That's the criticism.
Right.
So we have sort of hatred, you guys get it from all sides.
Right.
We've got hostility towards the press from the right, and then we've got hostility, what used to be the right, now the left, worrying about foreign interference, right?
Right.
So is there any truth in that?
So, and let me just finish one thought, then I'll come to that, which is that, because the other thing I think, in addition to sort of having doubts about freedom, the other thing I think that happens is there's so much information out there without any traditional gatekeepers that it's very easy to become cynical.
Yeah.
To just say, there's so much I can't believe that I read, and journalism gets swept up in that. You know, I'm just not going to believe anything at all. I'm going to burrow down in my own life. So you have this criticism coming from both sides, and we obviously join in the criticism, you know, the way Facebook and others have dealt with the foreign influence. And if you define that criticism from the right as, you know, our failure to give credit to the rise of conservative politics in this country, I think there probably were times when the media writ large, the mainstream media, really didn't understand what was going on in the country, didn't really understand how troubled many people were, how powerless many people were. We need to do a better job.
And if they had understood it, what could they have done?
I think you should, well, for one thing, I think you shed light on it and you start to understand that the election is going to be unpredictable. so you don't surprise a lot of people come November 9th, the day after. So on the left, a lot of the criticism is really aimed at, shouldn't the New York Times, the Washington Post, the CNN, NBC, ABC really be part of the resistance?
Yeah, right.
And the New York Times editors have talked about this. Dean Baquet, the executive editor, has talked about it. It's not really where we want to be. And he makes a very compelling point very early on, talking to the staff after the election, that if you follow the European model, where you align with one political party, you are in a very, very bad situation when that party then comes into power, because now you're a lapdog. You need to be able to keep your distance from both parties, from all political points of view as much as possible, and be an honest broker of that information. But there's obviously a lot of pressure, and a lot of journalism involves decisions. It always has, and it always will. And so we're open to being second guessed on that, and I think that's healthy. I think it's really healthy to have that kind of criticism.
Now, another source of criticism is, you could argue, neither right nor left, but is the national security community. And that's one that's been of particular interest to this center, since we are a center that deals with national security policy issues. And indeed, we held a conference that you attended a couple of years ago over at the Annenberg School to look at the intersection of national security and freedom of the press, and to try to understand sort of rights and responsibilities in both directions. One of the issues on which national security professionals might disagree with you First Amendment types is who should count as a journalist. Now, I note that in the case of, or a member of the press, I note that in the case of Julian Assange, there's an interesting division that happens here, right? Because the national security folks that we work with say he doesn't deserve press protection, he's not a journalist, he's not a publisher of information, he's just an out-and-out spy and a Russian stooge. Interestingly, the New York Times and the president, unlikely bedfellows, both took the position that he should be covered as a member of the press. So, I mean, indeed, I take it that's your position on Assange?
That's a very clear, that's a very, can we talk about other things? I, don't, I see we're out of time. I hope my position is more nuanced than that. And I'm going to walk through this because I always get in trouble when I talk about Assange, and Assange lawyers end up quoting me out of context, so I'm going to be really careful about this. But that is, when I think about Julian Assange from 2010, which were the first set of WikiLeaks, which the New York Times, The Guardian, and Der Spiegel printed some of, we thought of him as a source, and we thought of him as someone providing information to us. And if you then ask the question, okay, he's this intermediary, he's an unusual source, but he's an intermediary, he's as a publisher, we think he's a source. Should he be subject to prosecution for having disclosed information? I think it's easy for us to say it depends on what activity you're looking at. If the publication of secrets is what is being asked about, it's very hard to distinguish what he did from what the mainstream media does. If you're talking about him encouraging people to leak information, it's very hard to distinguish him from the mainstream media. Where we draw the line is that in the initial indictment of Assange, it said that he was helping Private Manning try to hack into a confidential, into a secure database. That has never been protected, nor is it part of routine journalism. If that was the end of what the government thought was criminal, there would be no support in journalism.
Right, so that would be true for any journalist, right?
Yep.
Any journalist who, says, I'm going to help you break into, the Watergate Hotel, for example,
Just to use an example.
To get these, documents would be prosecutable. So freedom of the press doesn't protect you on everything. So we're talking about, so if indeed he was active in helping Bradley Manning hack into secrets and then publish them, right? So that's not protected.
And let me back up. You're a real law professor. I'm a pretend law professor. So let me sort of let's begin with what I think is a very simple rendering of what the law says about this stuff. And this comes up most poignantly in the incident in the book, which I talk about, where somebody sends 3 pages of candidate Trump's tax returns in a plain envelope to a reporter, Sue Craig at the New York Times. So put classified, because we're going to get to foreign intelligence. Put that aside. So this is information that if a person working at a tax department has released it, that person's probably committed a crime. That person is not free under criminal law to take your tax returns or Trump's tax returns or my tax returns and send them to people. That's a crime. We receive them. The First Amendment protects our right to publish them as long as we didn't participate in the wrongdoing. That's the law. And so it becomes a very confusing incident because we get those. Our reporters do an incredible job of reconstructing from those 3 pages that Mr. Trump has probably not paid taxes for a 20-year period. And we run that, and his lawyers say that's illegal. We say, no, that's what the First Amendment is about. And a big dispute breaks out over whether it's legal or whether it's not. And I think to myself, this is not even a close call. The Supreme Court has decided this 6 times, that as long as the press has not engaged in the wrongdoing, there's a right to publish it.
Now define participate in the wrongdoing,
okay,
right? Because but for the fact
the wrongdoing
that you guys are going to publish it, those pages would not have been stolen.
So
what do you do with that?
You think of it as a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum is you just receive them in the mail. You are a passive recipient. That is the best place to be legally under the First Amendment, right? The other end of the spectrum is you're breaking into the Watergate or you're breaking into the RS and you're stealing those. That's the one place you don't want to be in the law. So and here's the irony, of course, is the best way legally for us to get something is the worst way journalistically, because we were concerned that we were being set up.
Right.
If these 3 pages show up, they look a little funky, okay? Because there's this one number, which is his net loss, and it's a huge number, and the type doesn't quite line up. And we're sort of saying, well, is somebody trying to make us, to stumble into an error? Because we would have been dead had we
Like the
called.
Washington Post. No, just.
You hit that soft spot. I'm ready to go there. Okay. I'm not going to say that. Okay, so, but our reporter, David Barstow, does an incredible job. He goes and finds Trump's accountant at a retirement village in Florida. He shows him the thing. Seriously, and the guy says, oh yeah, that's because the software I used wasn't big. It didn't have that many columns for the numbers, so I had to use an IBM Selectric to put in the rest of the numbers. That's why it's so funky. So it was clear to me that that under First Amendment law, we had the right to publish that. And, the New York Times comes out with an article, thankfully, vindicating my opinion, going around to law professors. And law professors said New York Times was right. They have a right to publish it. And I knew I was right because shortly thereafter, Fox News legal analysts said I was right. In this country, when the New York Times and Fox News say you're right, folks, you can go home, you got it right. Okay, so I was okay with that. Now we get to the hard cases, okay? So what happens when, to move into national security, a state sponsor of hacking hacks into somebody's emails and then passes those emails on to the press?
Right.
Again, under the tradition that, under the traditional analysis, we've done nothing wrong. We've just been sitting there and here they come in the mail or however they come to us. And
they say classified, top secret all over them.
Oh yeah, if you're talking about it on the government side, we can talk about that. But even the one incident that's received a lot of attention is that it looks like one of the state actors in the Middle East, in the Gulf state, hack into Elliot Broidy's email. Elliot Broidy is a Republican fundraiser, and those emails have now been passed along. And we would take the position the First Amendment still protects us. And I think that's right, but it feels different and harder, right? Because now are you in the press, are we in the press simply being manipulated by state actors? They have an agenda. There's a reason they broke in there to get those emails and try to embarrass this guy or do whatever they're going to do. And we struggle with that, and I think that's an important part of this process. What our editors say is at the end of the day, we look at the information, and if it's newsworthy, we're going to publish it, but at the same time, we need to know more. We need to be telling our readers more about how we do it.
Well, and you worry that you are wittingly or unwittingly fomenting the very activity that you're reporting on, right, in some cases. So if we talk a little bit about the Greg Craig case, which just finished, and Craig was just acquitted, though he was never tried on violating the Foreign Agent Registration Act, but we gather, called up David Sanger and said, I've got this report absolving the Ukrainian government from misbehavior with regard to a political rival, Tymoshenko, right? And calls up Sanger and says, you want to see it, I've got the scoop for you. Now, he's acting, we think, at the behest of Ukraine, right? Maybe violating the Foreign Agent Registration Act, maybe not acting as an attorney, but acting as a PR professional in doing that. Newsworthy or not, should Sanger be responding to that, taking those documents and then writing a story? Isn't he sort of functioning as a Ukraine handmaiden when he does that? Why isn't he?
We're really out of time right now. The answer to that is no, he's not. So here's, and I think what the Times did with those documents is exactly what they should do, which is they raise questions about them at the same time. It's everybody, and again, it gets tougher and to some extent has more sizzle when it's in the national security realm. But everybody has a motive for leaking information to the press. Whether that is, I want my client to sell more CDs, have more hits on Spotify, or whatever it might be. There's a motive there, right? I grew up being a lawyer for the Daily News gossip pages. And we would be running some terrible story about some celebrity who I didn't know who he was, and that the celebrity, the gossip writers always go, "You're serious? You don't know who this person is?" I said, "No, I really don't. I've never heard of him." You know, but it would be a terrible story about some rap star who was engaged in some really dodgy behavior. And I said, "I'm really uncomfortable publishing," and they would say, "Well, it's coming from him. He's the source. Okay?
Right.
He just wants to be in the newspaper, right?" So, the motivation gets very complicated. But, when people tell us stuff, they always have an agenda. That agenda should, trigger for a reporter to ask some hard questions about, is it true or not? Am I being lied to? Now, that's a different thing, as opposed to being concerned about the agenda for releasing it. In the Ukraine case, I don't think our reporters should or are required, I know they're not required, to wonder about, is someone violating the law by giving this to me, whether that's the Foreign Agent Registration Act, or whether it's the classified secret.
So I think that's right, and I think that's the essential point there. And by the way, I'm only picking on David because he's a friend and because he's been before this audience a number of times. But I think that's absolutely right. And so his duty is not to look into whether or not the sources violated the law, but whether or not his activity is protected within the First Amendment and journalistic privilege, and whether or not the story is newsworthy and accurately reported, I take it.
Yeah, and in most of these cases, as I said, just like with the tax returns, the law appears to be that we are protected. Now, no one's ever challenged the Espionage Act. Assange starts to push that. That you have classified information, and the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal or whoever it is publishes it. A publisher in the 102 years we've had an Espionage Act, it has never been applied to a publisher.
Right. So
always to a government actor.
Ironically, of course, we were all more worried about that happening under Obama than under the current administration, because there was Jim Rice, who lived with a sort of Damocles hanging over his head for a long time. And
yeah, but we should distinguish between the government coming after the reporter to find out who the source is.
Yes.
Where you're just seeking a witness, and that witness may refuse to testify, and that witness may go to jail for refusing to testify.
Versus being charged
under the
which
Espionage
is not
Act.
at issue.
Right, and one of the things, as you know from the book, is that where I get into a standoff with the government in a very uncomfortable way is we sue the government over documents, and they inadvertently produce a classified document to us. And so they have sent us this classified document, and what are we supposed to do? I mean.
Well, if the government sends it to you.
I like the way you're going so far.
Right. The government sends it to you. What doesn't that waive any objections?
It would seem to. They didn't see it that way, though. So they send this innertly. I feel like.
Now, which document is this? Do we know?
Yeah. We published it. It dealt with the surveillance, the cooperation with the phone companies. It identified.
Oh, that one. Okay,
right. It identifies.
Right.
It identified for the first time 3 phone companies, 3 wireless phone companies that were involved in the famous rolling up of people's metadata from their phone calls. They didn't mean to put it in there. There were hundreds of pages released. They were released, as always with the government, in response to our FOIA request. They're released at 6 o'clock in the evening. And a reporter, and I send them right on to a reporter because I don't know who else has requested these documents. We don't want to get scooped. Reporter calls and said, do you know there's a classified document in there? And I said, I do not know that, and I do not wish to know that, actually, because I know my life is going to become really interesting. And so the next day, the government lawyers start calling me and say, you have to give it back. You have to give it back. And I'm going, well, I don't, if Daniel Ellsberg can give us, volumes of classified documents, which we still have, and we haven't given them back since 1971, I don't understand how when you give them to us, I mean, Daniel stole them, right? Okay. I don't know how when you, Mr. Government Lawyer, give them to me, that is I have to give them back. And he really goes low on me. He says when this happened to the ACLU, they gave them back.
Oh. Did you call the ACLU?
Calling out my patriotism,
So
ISIS,
did you call the
ACLU, New York Times. I did call the ACLU.
Good for you. And?
I got a humada. Yeah, we did. But there was a nuanced answer, and they actually had done it. My friends at the ACLU I work closely with from time to time. Really, they said, look, when it happened to us first, the document didn't matter to us.
Oh, okay. Otherwise, we would have kept it.
No, if it had revealed that there was, that the government was torturing people, we were going to publish that. We were going to take the risk there because the public interest. However, in this context, we didn't feel that it was worth doing that. They went to court, and the judge said they had to give it back, which didn't make me feel very good either. Because my position had been with the government was, I'm happy to get on the phone with the judge. I'm happy to get on the phone with the judge. Let's have it. I'm not going to send this back. If a federal judge tells me we're in a different place, right? But and they kept saying, get back to you, hang up, and then they disappear. And then they call at 5. The government lawyers call me at 5 o'clock and say, just want to make sure how we get a hold of you this evening in case we decide to go to the judge. And I said, here's my cell phone number, but you might want to look at the New York Times website because the document's there.
and that was that.
That's called a little too late. And because it'd been all day, we've been having this conversation. But so the other thing, though, in fairness to the ACLU, they stand in a different place from us in terms of their reputation and how they want to look in front of the courts and so forth. And, they're not a publishing organization.
Well, I was about to say they're not members of the press,
right.
So they don't have the same protection that you do,
right.
so it's
right.
a very different...
Right, and I didn't have, I felt that we had met the standard I just talked about. We had not engaged in any illegality to get that. It was a document in the public interest. And in the end, the government and I agreed to disagree. They wrote a letter saying you have to give it back, and I wrote a letter that said I don't have to, citing Pentagon Papers and other cases. And
so let's talk about something that's not in the book, which is your argument in the Second Circuit last Friday.
Yeah.
So we have a novel issue, extraordinary, in this day and age, which is the tweeting president, and whether or not tweets that come from the Oval Office declassify documents. So tell us what you were arguing.
In the book, I talk about this case. It ends with us losing in the district court and saying we're going to appeal. And so now we're in front of the Second Circuit, and the Second Circuit will be making its decision at some point. But the question is a question I never dreamed I'd ever have to litigate, which is, does the president declassify information by tweeting national security secrets? And it just, even as I form that thought, it just doesn't seem like something that you'd have a legal issue over. So, but
and just, David, to make clear before you tell the story, if you get a hold of a classified document,
right.
It's not declassified
right.
by putting it up on the New York Times website, even though everyone has seen it, everyone has read it, it's still classified.
That's
unless
right.
the government chooses to declassify
right.
it.
The basic rule is really simple, that if somebody puts in a FOIA request asking for documents, the government can come back and say either, as they did in our case, we can't tell you if we have documents because that itself would reveal a national security secret. And then the question becomes whether the secrecy has been waived. Has the government officially disclosed the document or declassified the document? And so what happened in this case was the Washington Post ran a story one day. This was in 2017. The story essentially said that the president had ended the secret funding, the classified funding of the Syrian rebels. Syrian rebels had been funded through a secret program by our intelligence services to fight the Assad government, and President Trump had decided to end that. And so the Post story was very critical of the decision, quoting a lot of experts saying, we have hung the rebels out to dry. This is a terrible thing to do. The president, not a big fan of the Washington Post, writes a tweet that says the Amazon Washington Post, that's how he always refers to it because it's owned by Jeff Bezos, but the Amazon Washington Post fabricated the facts about my ending the wasteful, dangerous, massive payments to the Syrian rebels for arms to fight Assad.
But don't tell anyone
that was a
it's
classified secret. So we immediately send a FOIA request to the CIA saying, show us the documents about the wasteful, massive, dangerous program the president just ended. And they respond that they can't say whether they have documents or not because that would show a classified secret. So we sue them, and we end up in this incredible discussion with the government lawyers saying that we don't understand the president's syntax. Now, guilty as charged. We don't understand the president's syntax because they want to say, they kept saying, no, he says the Post fabricated the facts about the wasteful, massive, dangerous, his ending of it. We're going, well, that just doesn't make any sense where those words come from. The Post didn't use those words. And in fact, the Post article was suggesting it was a good thing, not wasteful and dangerous. And the next day, the president then spoke to the Wall Street Journal, and they asked him about the tweet, to which he said, well, you know, it's outrageous that the New York Times would write about that. And then the Wall Street Journal had our back saying, it wasn't the New York Times, it's the Washington Post. He goes, oh, right, it was the Post, okay. and he says, you know, but I wasn't involved in ending it. You know,
that program,
right,
whose existence I am now confirming.
And the weapons were going to Al-Qaeda.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just a slip of the Twitter tongue, as one would say. You know, and so I argued that case in the Second Circuit, pleading with the judges to read it in a sensible way, and I'm hopeful that I got through, and that in fact that declassified. But and this is and one of the things that helped us, of course, was the week before he had released the photograph of the explosion at the Iranian missile site, and when people said, that was a secret. He said that I have the absolute right to do that.
Right.
And I'm going like, that's my opening argument.
Right.
The president has the right to do that. And the CIA might not like the way he does that. The CIA may say he should follow procedures. He doesn't follow the procedures.
But is the question what's the legal issue here? Is the question whether or not a tweet constitutes an official declassification because it's an official communication, or whether or not the president has to indicate that he is hereby declassifying the material when he communicates it, which those are sort of two different questions.
Right. So the president has conceded in another case that his tweets are official communications.
Right.
Okay. If you recall, it's a case brought by my friends at the Knight Institute that the president was throwing people off his Twitter account who were saying hateful things about him, and they sued, saying that was a suppression of their free speech, and the Second Circuit ruled, and the president actually conceded that it was an official government forum. The only question was whether he had the right to send people away that he didn't want on his Twitter feed. So it was clearly an official communication. Then it got into that question of, as you know, declassification is an incredibly long process where the agencies get together and sort of pick over things and say, okay, now we can declassify the secret. And the government argued that wasn't declassified until it went through that process, which doesn't really make much sense.
Because it would deprive the president of the ability to declassify things on the spot, which
he has to have that power.
Never thought I'd be on the side of executive authority in this one, right? But that's in fact the argument. That's exactly the argument,
yeah. And to his credit, I think the president realizes too much is classified. The amount of classification is great. And he comes back to this. If you remember, he wanted to release the documents about Carter Page and the investigation of Carter Page. He wanted to release the photograph of the Iranian missile site. And so, there is obviously institutionalized national security apparatus that wants the process followed, and he finds it constraining. I find it constraining, and so we are.
So once again,
right,
we're on the same side.
We're on the same side.
And ironically, in the Obama administration, classification just mushroomed, right? And there was enormous increase in the amount of classification, and there is a sort of extreme problem of over-classification that we've looked at from various angles as well. The question is whether you're making sound policy by dealing with that problem through selective tweeting. And you might remember that when General Mattis was Secretary of Defense and he was told to put in place a transgender ban.
Yep.
He said, I was told by tweet that's not an official order. I won't do it. I'll wait for an official order. Is the question of declassification an official pronouncement, you think, the same as whether something's an order by tweet?
Well, you're going to really get at my totally absent military background. I do think that if we're going to have government by tweets, which I think is where I think we're here. And I think the next president's likely to do it, the Obama tweet as well. That those things are going to be treated like other kinds of pronouncements.
Communications.
And the last question I got from the Second Circuit on Friday was, do you think that if we rule in your favor, that there will be more responsible tweeting? And I thought, what an unintended consequence. We kind of like the irresponsible kind. But I didn't say that. I said, I just said that.
So it brings us back to Julian Assange, right?
But let me just one last point of classification, because one of the things that this whole discussion that we're having and that I've had with others drives me back to is when you go back to the Pentagon Papers, Justice Stewart got this exactly right. Because what he writes in his concurrence in the Pentagon Papers, 1971, is that when everything's classified, nothing is classified. And that when you have overclassification, you get two results: carelessness and cynicism. People don't know what's secret, or they realize it's foolish. And we have just lived that out. So back to Assange.
Yeah. So the problem is here, the fundamental problem that we have is we don't know who is a journalist and who is a member of the press. And we have this problem not just in the Assange type case where there's a national security concern that would seem to dequalify someone from being considered a member of the press, but we have it with, Joe Schmo sitting in his basement in his sweats tweeting out information, right? And does that person get to claim press privilege? Does the Times weaken, ironically, press privilege by taking such a broad stance on it, right? Why isn't your stance, look, we're the New York Times, and they're the Washington Post, and right? So we are legitimate journalism, but the guy with the Twitter feed, I don't mean the one in the Oval Office, I mean the one in his basement, is not a publisher of information.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that is that the law, as articulated by the Supreme Court, has not distinguished between the New York Times and individuals. I mean, they have essentially, they have not said there are special press privileges. What they have said is the First Amendment that applies to the public, of which the press is one. And so, for instance, when the Supreme Court said there is a First Amendment right in 1980 in the Richmond newspaper, there's a First Amendment right to attend criminal proceedings unless some high threshold is met. It didn't say for the press, it said for the public, of which the press is one member. So we've not had to make that distinction. The law has not made that distinction as a constitutional matter. Now, where we've seen it is when there have been shield laws that say to journalists, you don't have to reveal your source, Mr. Journalist and Ms. Journalist. And there they've had to define it.
So there's a statutory basis for distinguishing.
Exactly right. But you really put your finger on, I think, the two hard issues that are at the margins. One is the person who does not look like a journalist but is using Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or whatever it is to communicate to mass audiences. So it looks like an act of journalism. Should that person be protected as a journalist, and to whatever degree there are protections for journalists? The other one you put your finger on, and we talked about earlier, is what about RT, a Russian organization that appears to be part of the Russian government?
Right, so RT was forced to register under the Foreign Agent Registration Act, with the consequence that it lost its congressional press standing. Now, whether or not congressional press standing means press standing for all other purposes, for example, First Amendment purposes, I doubt, but at any rate, that's the wrinkle on this.
So in New York, and to use the example, in New York State, there is an absolute privilege for a journalist, by statute, by law, for a journalist to protect her source.
Right.
Okay? That if a reporter is called by a grand jury, called by a civil litigant, is called by a prosecutor, there is an absolute right not to disclose source. If that reporter happens to be working for RT,
Are they still going to have?
should they have that privilege?
Presumably they do, and the fact that they don't have that privilege with regard to Congress arguably is irrelevant, but it's a problem.
Right. Yeah, and I've actually had a prosecutor tell me that the Latin Kings have a magazine. Now, I don't know this for a fact. I don't subscribe. And this is always the example. The Latin Kings Quarterly or whatever it might be. Frontiers of drug dealing. Cryptocurrency and drugs. I don't know what they write about in their place. But he says, well, how can that be that you're going to treat those? Or of course, Al Qaeda had Inspire, the online magazine. All that. So
all right. So that's our problem.
Right. So, but if you are playing it by the book, you just look at the statute and how it defines journalism, and the court's going to be called upon to decide the hard issues.
Now we have the problem with Al Jazeera, right? Because the UAE is mounting a big campaign to get Al Jazeera to register under FARA on the grounds that it's receives funding from Qatar. And then the argument is, well, if Al Jazeera has to register, why not the BBC, right? And then pretty soon, anyone who receives state funding. So what's the answer to that sort of problem?
Yeah, to the extent it becomes relevant for a statute like FARA, which requires foreign agents to register, I think I can in my mind draw a distinction between the BBC and RT. And BBC seems much more like entities in this country that receive some public funding, National Public Radio, PBS, and obviously small amounts of funding in both cases. But they have functional independence. They are not funded. They're not the Voice of America. They're not a government agency. And I think RT is much closer aligned with doing the bidding of a foreign government, and to the degree that becomes relevant, that you have to decide whether they're an independent journalism organization or they're a wing of a foreign government, it's much easier to see them in the wing of foreign government category.
So doesn't all this come down to the integrity with which the news organization or the purported news organization is carrying out its mandate? Can we really get away from exercising substantive judgments and substantive distinctions about the degree to which that organization is actually tracking facts, tracking truth, engaging in responsible reporting, seeking to inform the public as opposed to seeking to do propaganda work for some, can we get away from those substantive and hence somewhat subjective distinctions?
Well, I think in that limited category of trying to decide whether an organization like RT is essentially a functional government agent, we can't. We have to look at how they actually go about their business. But that ends up being a really narrow category. Come back to the point I kind of came in on, which is that the First Amendment was not defined as a right given to the responsible. It was a right given to the people with the hope that they would use it responsibly. And that when we're talking about American media and what American media does, it's important, I think, to recognize the rights of people who are going to use it irresponsibly to still have that right. One of the things that is concerning about that is a concern that runs through the book for me is this idea that we should regulate the internet because there's so much stuff out there that's just terrible, and nobody's arguing that. Whether it's fake news or hate speech or trolling or whatever it might be. And the unsatisfying answer I keep coming back to is that we actually need to be better readers and better viewers and better users. And that's a long-term process, and I get that's not a really satisfying answer, and it's not as easy as saying, well, let's regulate internet speech. One of the things you can imagine in my job that I developed a sixth sense about is an email I don't really want to read, okay? I can look at it and I can kind of see. So I see one day that says, that begins, I can see the beginning of it, says, why did you write this book? I'm like, oh, it's too late at night to read that one, okay? Because that can't be going anyplace good, right? And so the next morning I looked at it, you know, I'm now fully invigorated, ready to take my beating on the, you know, from this email. But it wasn't, it was a great email. She said, why did you write this book? You should be writing for young adults. You should be writing for children, because they're the ones who need to have literacy about the internet and how to use media and all that. And it's a really smart point. But it's also indicative of that if we want a better internet, we need to have better users, more responsible users, and people who are going to make discernment. It's one of the things that I really find troubling about the labeling of things as fake news, because you know the labeling of things fake news more than 300 times in 2 years. The president used that term on Twitter more than 300 times. Is that it's toxic, but it's also kind of brilliant, right? Because it sounds like something somebody would say who is interested in the pursuit of truth. Right? Fake news, I'm in the pursuit of truth. Well, it's just the opposite. It is inviting people to label and dismiss, when we really need people who are going to read and discern and question and have an active mind. And that is a big concern.
So do you think, and I'll let in members of the audience after this question, do you think people care enough about tracking the truth? Do they care enough about facts? Or are we living in a kind of post-truth era? And I worry increasingly about that. When you look at, as you're suggesting, young people who have grown up with the internet. I still get my paper copy of the New York Times and don't love reading it online. But increasingly I feel it's kind of antediluvian and see, you know, kids, to the extent that they track news at all, is just what pops up in their Facebook accounts or their Twitter accounts or what have you. And that's much less likely to tie them in with facts, much less likely to tie them in with objectivity. Are we starting to lose interest?
I should give the aspirational answer. I hope not. But you know, it's in John Meacham's book, The Soul of America, which is really very comforting to read, because he shows that over and over again there's been a fight between appealing to people's fears and appealing to people's hopes. And whether you're talking about the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, whether you're talking about the rise of fascism in the United States in the 30s, that people can find an audience for fear. Mm-hmm. And then you see that countering that, whether it's FDR or any whatever else, whether it's the anti-Ku Klux Klan campaign that takes place twice in our country, you can't appeal to people's better angels, and it works. And so I'm hopeful that that's still the case, is that the appeal can still work. I share with you a concern about people's willingness to turn their mind off. And that's why that email is so important. We need to start with young adults. We need to start with children. And I think also we just have to look at this as, I think that we need to stop thinking about the embrace of freedom as a democratic issue versus a Republican issue. Right. So I'd like to say, and then we can take questions, you know, I didn't become a lover of the free press walking the streets of Manhattan. I became a lover of the free press walking the streets of Monticello, Illinois, population 4,100 on a good day. And if you were like me, a kid growing up in Illinois in the 1960s and the 1970s, you knew one thing about politics, and that is your governor goes to jail. Yeah, okay. Otto Kerner, governor of Illinois, went to jail. Dan Walker, governor of Illinois, went to jail. The other guy got off, tribute to all the lawyers in the audience there, okay? Secretary of State died when I was a teenager, Paul Powell. He died, and they just found shoeboxes full of money in his office, okay? And I was I grew up in a very conservative place, and we were thankful that there was a free press. We were thankful that because those guys were going to steal from us, okay? And so I think the liberals in this country have done a disservice by sort of, not reminding people that being a believer in a free press is not a political act, it's an American act.
But if you look at the different, President Nixon resigned once all the facts came out, or most of them. We don't know what we don't know, right? But once it was clear that he was connected with the burglary, and there was no hiding that, and it was fairly clear that the however many minutes of tape disappeared and so on at their behest. He had to step down. And in fact, if you go back and watch his resignation speech, it's really very moving because he says, this is better for the country.
Right.
It's better for the country that I step down. I don't see President Trump ever resigning no matter what comes out. And it's because he has the support to stay.
Yeah. Yes. We didn't see the Nixon speech, which would have been, I'm so glad Mitch McConnell is running the Senate. I'm staying.
All right, let's get members of the audience in. And there are 2 roving mics going around, I think 2. And we'll try to get one mic. Trudy Rubin, yeah.
Trudy Rubin from the Philadelphia Inquirer, another struggling media person.
Trudy.
I want to pick up on something that Claire was asking towards the end about facts and do people care about facts, or are people simply losing the belief in facts? The Times waged a campaign about truth. You had ads on TV, you had buttons that said, truth is hard. So first I'd like to ask you, how did you decide finally to use the word lie about President Trump's remarks? And do you think what the Post does in sort of tallying the number of lies, or, is there a way effectively to get across the difference between truth and lies? And the second thing, this is just a broad question, but I've covered foreign news for most of my life, and I used to think that Egypt and Pakistan were the repository of conspiracy theories. I used to write about how their worldviews were shaped because people needed to shape a worldview and didn't trust any source of facts. How much is that a threat here? Because conspiracy theories have gone so mainstream. Can the New York Times hold out against a large part of the world that believes in conspiracy, a large part of the United States that now believes in conspiracy theories, especially if a lot of news deserts emerge when smaller papers die?
Yeah, a lot of stuff in there. The question about how did the New York Times come to label Trump's statements as not misstatements, misrepresentations, but lies, comes about during the campaign, and it dealt initially with the story about whether Obama was born in this country or not. And obviously that's an editorial, it's not a legal decision. I freely defend the use of the word lie. I don't have any problem with that as a lawyer standpoint, but you're really talking about it as a journalistic matter. And as I talk about in the book, our senior editors came to the point they felt that to call them anything else was to hedge on the truth, and that we shouldn't be hedging on the truth. We say people die. We didn't say they passed away or passed on or are no longer with us. They say die, and that they should do that too. We've kind of backed away from it, and I think that to some extent it was a little bit distracting A woman wrote to the Times saying, stop saying the president lies. Don't you know delusion when you see it? He actually believes this stuff. But he kind of got, as cute as that was, it gets at the problem with the Wall Street Journal has talked about this, its editor talked about this, was that what is it to lie? The lie is that to knowingly misrepresent. We as journalists don't know what's inside people's heads. As somebody said, well, after you tell your 4,000th lie, maybe you do. Maybe you can figure out what's going on there. So, but in the book, I talk about it as I think it's kind of a distraction. In terms of Claire's point and Trudy, your well-made point that, do people really care about the facts? Have they lost an interest in that? I hope that's not the case. I don't think that changes how the Philadelphia Inquirer, the New York Times, or anybody goes about its business. We have no choice but to continue to try in the hopes that the facts matter. There's just we can't suddenly put out a paper that says, we give up on you guys. We're not saying anything to you because you don't care. But yeah, so I think you just have to keep at it, and you hope that hope comes back.
So do we have another microphone already in place? Let's try to get the next one in place so we can move right ahead. We have several people with hands up here. And yeah, let's get another one in place so we can go right ahead.
Hi, Alexandra Mize. I'm a fellow of CERL, and I also teach human rights. And one thing that I've noticed in the past few years is that many of my students are foreign-trained lawyers. And the U.S. is an exception when it comes to freedom of speech, and especially with hate speech, which you mentioned as being something that is proliferating online. And I've watched my U.S. students have their positions change in the matter of hate speech, and whether perhaps they're willing to entertain a government intrusion on speech, especially when it comes to hate speech. And I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on these proposals.
Yeah, tough issue, and I agree with you that when you teach a class that has foreign-trained lawyers, as I have and as I do, and American, it's one of those places where you really see a difference. The first semester I taught at NYU, I had a Chinese lawyer. She just graduated from law school in Shanghai, and she came to me and said, about halfway through the semester, and said that the class started to make sense to her when she realized that what she thought the right answer was always the wrong answer, and once she just switched, she always said, "What was the wrong answer?" And I got U.S. law down. Okay, because that idea that the individual freedom was just not part of the Chinese game plan. I still am firmly in the camp that suggests that the answer to hate speech is not regulation. I'm concerned about how it gets regulated. I'm concerned about who makes that decision of what constitutes hate speech. And I think that, again, the answer lies, as imperfect as it is, with having people who are willing to stand up to hate speech and call it out and make an issue of it. You sort of think about people getting locked in, the victims of hate speech, and I do think that hate speech hurts. I'm not denying that. And the people who are the perpetrators of hate speech, and they are perpetrators, the real question is, what do the people in the middle do? Do you shrug and just say, oh, well, they're not saying it about me, it's okay for now. The people in the middle are the people who need to speak up. I also think that if Facebook and Twitter are going to portray themselves as First Amendment protected actors, they should use some of their First Amendment freedom to do a better job of policing what is online. They're private actors, they can do that. They kind of get very much start waving the First Amendment flag. I don't think that's any different than the New York Times saying, we're not going to run your letter to the editor because it's hate-filled. No reason Facebook couldn't do the same thing when it feels that someone's crossed the line of decency. Hard issue.
We have another question over here,
Yes.
and then I think there's a gentleman down here who had his hand up.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to Professor Finkelstein's comments. that perhaps young people do not care about facts. I'm more in Mr. McCraw's camp. I think young people do care about facts. I think what happened, however, is particularly during and after the 2016 election, there was a major loss of confidence in the fair, the equitable reporting of the press. And I personally have been a reader of the New York Times for my entire life and was raised in New York. And I no longer have a subscription to the New York Times as a result of what happened in this 2016 and also the previous, during the decade. And I'll tell you, there were two major omissions. And I think that omissions are incredibly important in terms of framing the viewpoint of the public about an institution as veritable, as wonderful as the New York Times was. And that is the omission of fair reporting about Bernie Sanders. He certainly did not get equal time. The New York Times had selected Hillary Clinton. That was very clear to the young people who supported Bernie Sanders. The second major omission was the Occupy movement. And thank goodness for Nicholas Kristof, who was brave enough to write very lovely, did a lot of good reporting on the editorial page when the New York Times essentially ignored its existence and it was happening right under its nose. So my concern is really, if we're talking about facts, then what is the responsibility of the press to actually report all the facts?
Yeah, really good questions, and I think you put your finger on it, is that there is a world of facts out there and somebody makes a human decision about what to include and what not to include. The example I use is that if you were covering the Parkland shooting, if a reporter was covering the Parkland shooting and a reporter wrote that dozens of students were killed by a shooter, that's a true statement, just as if someone had written hundreds escape shooter, and focus on who survived. That's a true statement too. Somebody has to make a news judgment, and because that's a human decision, it's fraught with the usual problems of being a human being making a decision. I certainly have heard exactly what you're saying about Sanders and about Occupy, and I certainly understand why people see that. The only thing I would say is I don't think that was a conscious bias. I think that was somebody making a decision about what editors thought should be news, and following that, and that's an imperfect decision, and I certainly think that people who look at that and see that are not making it up. But I would question any sort of attempt to discern a motive there. It's the last point I'd make about this is that one of the things that is so different from when I started, I graduated from journalism school, worked at a small paper in Iowa more than 40 years ago now. We didn't know what our readers wanted. We thought we did. we would always say, readers want to read this, and readers want to read that, and we had no idea what readers wanted, right? We now know what our readers want. And so whether we should cater to it is another question, how much we cater to it. But one of the wonderful things, I've hit it hard against the internet tonight, one of the wonderful things is that we have much better understanding, thanks to Twitter and everything else. When we screw up, you folks let us know. And that is a really good thing. I may disagree with you whether we screwed up or not, but hearing from people has been useful. And I think that hearing from the Sanders people or the Clinton people or whoever it was, the Trump people who thought that we were unfair, is a really healthy exercise. We may still not get it right, but hearing that helps us get closer to right.
So we have time for just 2 or 3 more.
Yes, I want to know the difference legally between a journalist and a member of the press. I thought those were synonyms.
I'm going to say they're synonyms. Where's this leading?
No, I just,
Oh,
you
yeah.
seem to be treating them differently.
No, I was just trying to use different, yeah, I would treat them the same.
Well, with Assange, we were talking about publisher of information versus a journalist. So they would both
Yeah, okay,
arguably
right.
be protected by press freedom.
Right.
But you wouldn't call Assange necessarily a journalist, but rather a publisher of information. So that's the.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you very much for a remarkable presentation. My name is Jean-Louis Warshawski, and I just have a problem of logic and consistency and intellectual integrity, which you might perhaps give your own take and your own light on it. We have been given to understand from our birth that we live in a democracy run by a government for the people, by the people, with the people. How is it then that the said government can authorize itself to declare what information it will withhold from the said people who are his employer? Could you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, and this is one of those really interesting things about what's happened with freedom of information in this country, right? That the Freedom of Information Act, signed into law July 4th, 1966, says that there's a presumption that the people own the information and they have a right to it, and then the government makes exceptions, which they think are going to be limited. And of course, as you point out, the exceptions have now eaten the law. And the answer is, to my way of thinking, that there needs to be much greater transparency. We need more people, more judges who are willing to say, it is the people's information and you have a right to it. I'm not a radical transparency guy who thinks that there should be nothing secret, but I think there can be a lot more public than there is.
Hello, I'm a first-year student here at Penn. My question actually goes off a little bit of how you just ended that statement,
Yeah.
which is going back to thinking about Assange and some of the big dumps on we believe that have happened. We know that the next day there have been some assets in foreign countries that have.
You could speak a little bit louder?
Sure. So after
Just hold the mic a
those
little closer,
quick
yeah.
leaks, we know that there have been assets the following day that have disappeared. These are people in foreign countries who were working with the U.S. government, trying to help make their own countries more democratic. And if we were to pretend that Assange did not do anything, did not participate in a hack, but was a legitimate journalist, how do you think about the lives on the ground, especially the people affected by declassifying or making that information public? And a disclaimer, I say this as the fiance of a U.S. Army Ranger who was instrumental in the fall of Western Norfolk as part of a previously classified operation. And so I am concerned about transparency, but also worried about the day that becomes more important than his safety.
Great
Right.
question.
It's a very good question. And, you know, in the Snowden releases, somebody published from the Snowden releases that Sweden was involved in the monitoring of human rights violations and other things in Russia. I don't understand how that advances anything.
Right.
To me, that's not a decision that I would want to make. Let me take a sidestep and then be a little more direct in answering this. The sidestep is this, is that the reason the New York Times and Julian Assange had a falling out and had a serious falling out was that we did not believe that you should just publish everything you had. In the first release in 2010 of documents, thousands of documents, Assange had thousands of documents. We published less than 30 in the first round. And we very carefully redacted out of the very concern you're talking about. I talk about in the book going to this room where there are the finest foreign journalists, foreign correspondents I know, sitting with computer nerds, looking at the redactions, making sure we're taking out the names of anybody who might be harmed in our best judgment. Those are all then sent to me in legal to read again to see if we've done that. And I think that kind of discernment's necessary. And Julian Assange didn't believe in that. He now denies this, but he said it, that people deserve to die, and that he was just, that information should be free, and he was going to put it out there. So my answer to you is that we should be concerned about that, and I think the journalists at the New York Times have been concerned about that. I can't say that we always get it right. It's a very difficult decision that, and it's one of the reasons, and this is the other falling out we have with Julian, is that we, as a matter of practice, go to the government and say, we're about to publish this information. Let's have a discussion. And if the government is able to make that case that people are going to be harmed, we're going to back down. Do we always get that right? Good question.
This came up, I think the question is really an excellent one, because you might remember how much Obama said he wrestled with the question of publishing the photos from Abu Ghraib, putting out the second batch of information coming out of Abu Ghraib, and how he was concerned it would endanger people abroad, and the documents regarding the enhanced interrogation, a spate of documents that also came out.
But it's a really serious and good question, and this isn't to shift the blame, it's just to give some context. This would be easier if they didn't classify everything.
Yeah.
If you could trust classification. Obama says as he's leaving office, he gives an interview to David Remnick, the New Yorker, and he says, there's classified and there's classified.
Right.
That's his quote. There are some things, in other words, there are some things that should be classified, and there's stuff that we just classify because we classify stuff. They don't tell us which category, you don't get, like when you look at the documents, it has classified, it doesn't have red if it's really classified, and
Well, there are levels, but not everything that's top secret.
Right, exactly right. And that quote from the president is now in every brief I write.
But I think to answer the question fairly, one has to say, it's not just that you're willing sometimes to back down if you think people will be harmed and the government tells you, but sometimes you're maybe not, right? And sometimes you have to accept risks for the sake of transparency. When we accept those risks and when we don't, that's a really hard question. But not every hard problem has an easy answer or even a correct answer, right, in the end. We are out of time. I want to end by not only thanking David, but just reading a short quote from the end of the book. And it's an absolutely beautifully written book. I hope you will buy it, have him sign it, and join us for a reception. David writes, in the very end of the book, in a chapter entitled, "The First Amendment is Dead, a Love Story." The First Amendment story is, in the end, not about law, but about hearts and minds. It doesn't really matter how much freedom journalists have if no one believes them. A discredited press plays no role in shaping democracy and holding power accountable. And a public that finds a press contemptible holds no stake in defending First Amendment values and standing up for press freedom. Here at CERL, we do not find the New York Times contemptible. We do not think it is the failing New York Times, and we're in great admiration of the work you do, and just keep doing it. And we thank you so much for your book.
And please join us for a reception in the Haga Lounge or the Goat for you Penn Law graduates. Buy the book.
That was